Hey, welcome everybody. This is Maha Bailey from the American University in Cairo and co-organizer of the Mid-Year Festival. And I'm not gonna keep you for long. We have Sarah Elaine Eaton today, who is one of the most inspiring people to hear talk about academic integrity. And I've known about her work for quite some time, but I'm also really, really excited about two things that she's been talking about recently, which is AI and academic integrity, and also, and you know, what she called the post-plagiarism era may be coming soon, but also your new role with DEI and academic integrity. And I'm so looking forward to this session. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. There's a whole set of wonderful people here who think and talk and worry about AI and academic integrity. And Sarah has promised to give us an interactive session. So Sarah, I'm going to leave it to you and feel free to introduce yourself more formally.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Maha. Thank you to you and the MyFest team. Special thanks to Yasser for preparations for today. So as Maha said, my name is Sarah Elaine Eaton. I'm joining you today from Calgary, and I'll begin with a land acknowledgement in just a moment. But before I get there, just wanted to also start by letting folks in the room know who may not have their cameras on or who may not be able to see me very well that I'm a white woman and I have chin length curly hair and green eyes, and I'm wearing glasses with a red frame. Today I have on a gray headband and a black and green shirt. I do have a slide deck that I will pull up, but today is meant to be interactive. So I will just I will just start with that slide deck. So please stand by just a moment. Apparently I have some firewall settings on Zoom that I need to update. So that's not going to happen right now. Instead, I'm just going to adapt and see if I can share my screen in a different way. Oh, there we go. Now PowerPoint is being agreeable. There, you should be able to see some slides on your screen. I may not have them up the whole time. I may take them down so that we can have some conversation and see each other. But just kind of wanted to start by framing a couple of things today. Thank you for taking the time to join in today. I know how busy everyone is, and that making the time for real-time sessions or watching a recording means that you're taking time away from someone else. So just and someone or something else. So just wanted to acknowledge how grateful I am for all of you being here today. And wanted to also start with an acknowledgement of the land from which I'm joining you from today. I mentioned that I'm joining you from Calgary, Canada. I'm situated on the lands of the Treaty 7 people in southern Alberta. So this is comprised of, it includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika people, the Kainai and the Piikani First Nations, and also the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. And my home, the city of Calgary, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And I'm very pleased to be with all of you here today. So I kind of wanted to start with just kind of get us off with a little bit of conversation and thinking about what are your thoughts about the role of equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility with regards to artificial intelligence and its use in education. What do you think it might be, the good, the bad, the ugly? I wanted to kind of get a little bit of taking the temperature of the room and just generate some conversation for us to start. So it's not just me and my slides. So maybe I'll stop the slide share for now so that we can have a couple of minutes of conversation before we go back into the content. Feel free to use the meeting chat or open your mic to engage in conversation to share your thoughts. And also, if you feel like introducing yourself in the meeting chat and letting me know where you're joining from today, that's also helpful. And just for the purposes of anyone who might not be able to easily see the chat, I'll read out some of the comments that I see. And I see Mark says he's been experimenting with machine-assisted writing courses at USC, and Maha saying, oh, so many ways AI can exacerbate inequity for some groups, but it empowers others. That's exactly what I was hoping to talk about. We've got bias in AI, concerned about equal access to generative AI, but excited about the advantages it may offer for accessibility. And the focus on Gen AI might also interfere with how AI more generally can be used to support inclusive and accessible practice. Yes. In the worst cases, AI exacerbates fears that already existed that tech can be abused and students will cheat. Yes, and I'll offer a reflection there. I was watching a news article on Al Jazeera the other day, and the journalist was interviewing a robot by the name of Sophia that could interact with a journalist. And Sophia's purpose, of course, is to be helpful and promote peaceful interactions between humans. And the journalist contrasted by saying, what do you think about the use of autonomous weapons that are powered by generative AI? And the robot named Sophia said that AI should be helpful. And that for me set up an interesting conundrum in my head. And I thought, well, if AI can reflect the biases that we have in humanity, then one of those biases might be, should the use of AI be used only for good and peaceful purposes, or should AI be used for things like autonomous warfare? And of course, there's no answers to those kind of things right now. They're really big questions. But to be able to see that reflected in a mainstream journalistic interview was quite eye-opening for me, because we see these different technologies being developed, and they will reflect so much of what we have in humanity in terms of our philosophical, axiological, and practical biases as well. Okay, so I'm just kind of recognizing some of the comments here in the chat. That AI can be inequitable for some groups of people, given the demographic, location, accessibility, and knowledge in general. Yes, absolutely agree with that. I'm seeing some other comments that are echoing similar ideas. And Mark's comment here of AI having a chilling effect on first-generation voices and students who don't come from households where standard English pervades, usually means white. Yes. Yeah, and then the robot's name had been officially and intentionally named Sophia for the very reasons that Danielle points out about being connected with wisdom and intelligence. Yeah, and it was a very interesting interview. I don't know if Al Jazeera will have posted that on their website, but it's definitely worth looking up. Okay, I'll go back to the slides now. Thanks so much for the interaction. It really helps me. It also invigorates me in terms of joining with all of you today. So that's our thinking question. Feel free to continue to contribute to the chat if you like. And just because I work in academic integrity, I always like to talk a little bit about the provenance of the work. I came to both of the areas like artificial intelligence and EDI, mainly through a book called Plagiarism in Education, Higher Education, Tackling Tough Topics in Academic Integrity. And then some other subsequent works, with the Handbook of Academic Integrity being the most recent. And I can tell you through this book in plagiarism, originally chapter 9 was supposed to be about international students, and it was international students and tackling the taboo. And coming from Canada, we have lots of students from other countries. Some universities are telling me now that in some programs, they have 80 to 90% of international students. I was out in Cape Breton last weekend, which is an island on the eastern part of Canada, just off Nova Scotia. It's part of Nova Scotia. At Cape Breton University, and their associate dean of business was telling me in some of their programs they have 90% international students. Where I'm at the University of Calgary, our programs have usually 20 to 30% international students. There's a lot of assumptions made about international students and academic misconduct. And I push back against the term international student when we talk about academic misconduct. And the reason for that, there's lots of reasons for that. And that is because, at least where I'm situated, and I would say it's probably not uncommon in many North American contexts and English-speaking contexts, when we talk about international student and academic misconduct, we're not talking about white students from the United States for whom English is a first language, or British students who come here to study, or students from Australia, or even students from Germany or Northern Europe. If we say the words international student and misconduct, it's usually a proxy for students who are not white and for whom English is an additional language. in Canada at least, the term international student is a legal term that means individuals who are on a study permit, foreign-born individuals who are on a study permit to study in Canada. That includes students from all countries, including our neighbors to the south in the United States. But this term becomes conflated with a cheating student who's not white. So I've been starting to push back against this use of the term, incorrect or imprecise use of the term international student, because it gets conflated with otherness and othering from other places. And I started really grappling with this when I was working on the book Plagiarism in Higher Education, because this chapter 9 about international students didn't sit right. So what was in the proposal got ripped apart, and I'm like, no, this needs a different focus. And so it became around equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. And this book, I was writing it in 2020, and at that time there was almost nothing in my area of academic integrity that explicitly talked about what in Canada we call EDIA, equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility. I know the phrasing gets it's different in different places. But people had talked about, again, international students and English language students, and there was a real tension in the literature about, are these students cheating more? I say these students, right? That othering was there in the literature, and others saying that international students needed more support, but there was no questioning of the term international students, whether it was from the UK, Australia, North America. Like, this is a problem. And at the same time, wanting to think about ideas of decolonization and indigenization. So that was like my beginnings of into this work. And that work also at the end of it started contemplating, like, what does the future of academic integrity look like? And then that led to ideas around post-plagiarism. So I can talk about some of that later. So this is kind of where some of the work originates from. Here on the screen, you'll see what's this framework for the comprehensive academic integrity framework, looking beyond student conduct. This framework comes from one of the books that I mentioned at the end, which is the Handbook of Academic Integrity. It's in production now, it's not out, but it's a second edition. The first edition was done in 2016 by Tracy Bretag, and I was invited to do the second edition after Tracy Bretag passed away. And we have 112 chapters. And as I was reading through them, so as the editor-in-chief, that was part of my role, I wanted to draw a through line. And the through line was, it's going to be 2 volumes. I'm excited to see it in print when it comes out. The through line was that our notions of academic integrity, of student conduct, need to be challenged. And that academic integrity, thinking in a different way of integrity in the academy, or integrity in educational settings, or integrity in educational research settings, can include but must extend beyond student conduct, with a repeated message coming through in the handbook that we can't expect students to act with integrity if the institutions in which they're learning are corrupt. I'm not suggesting that any of our institutions are corrupt, but there's 112 chapters from all over the world. So there's lots of different perspectives. Corruption and fraud are some of the things that come through, including corruption and fraud committed by professors, researchers, and that students in this are not the enemy. Glenda, to your question, is the handbook open access? And I'm sorry to say, no, it's not. I did ask the publisher about it. So this is Springer's the publisher. They have a number of open access books, but their handbook series, the major reference works, are not among them. However, all is not lost, because the second book that I didn't really talk about there, Academic Integrity in Canada, is open access. It's not the handbook. I think actually the quality is about the same, and that is available. I don't have the link handy, so if someone has the link and wants to pop it in the chat, that I would appreciate it. Academic Integrity in Canada has, I think, 37 chapters, including 2 really, really great chapters on decolonization and indigenization of academic integrity, written by Gabrielle Lindstrom, and another's written by Kita Gladue and Yvonne Poitras-Pratt, all of whom are Indigenous scholars in Western Canada, and they really start to challenge some of these colonial ideas around what does it mean to act with integrity in higher education. Thank you for sharing the link. And that book is completely open access. You can get any of it with a comprehensive framework for academic integrity. So I will say that my colleague Karen Ford at the University of British Columbia calls this the colorful swirly donut of integrity. There's 8 sort of supposed to be overlapping ideas about what does ethics and integrity mean. I did do a summary. So Springer doesn't allow me to post the chapters on online freely, but I was allowed to post a chapter summary. So I did, and it's available free of charge. And if you look up comprehensive academic integrity within quotation marks on Google, you should find it through our institutional digital repository at the University of Calgary. And basically it's a summary of everything that's in the chapter, and everything that's in this chapter synthesizes what's in the whole handbook. So I pull out different ideas from it. But there's these 8 overlapping. So again, if someone has the link or might want to share the link, I don't have it handy, but I can see if I can pull it up as well. Then thank you. Thank you, Newman, for sharing it. And I wanted to, again, pull this through line, but thinking about ethics and academic integrity in really challenging ideas about student conduct and the need to punish students for misbehavior. There's academic misconduct, which is like plagiarism, exam cheating, and then there's non-academic misconduct, student bullying, harassment, fighting, that kind of thing. But these are all considered sort of violations of expectations in higher education, and can be subject to punishment. And what does it look to do things differently? And this framework is from the 112 chapters. I think there's about 150 authors in total, because some of the chapters have more than one author. But thinking about things like what's the role of ethical leadership and institutional ethics, and leadership and institutions setting the tone and expectations, not just through lip service, but also through actions, systems, protocols, policies, transparency, etc. Some great chapters that talk about the connection between academic integrity and ethical decision-making in everyday life and workplace behavior, and how one is a foundation for the other. And personal and collegial ethics. So some people had framed this as civility and courtesy between and among colleagues, right? I'm not sure what it's like at your university. Some of our authors talked about incivility between professors not talking to each other, engaging in, discussions, yelling, fighting, talking behind one another's backs, and this sort of thing. And that this does not set a stage for integrity for students to model that we're expected to model the behavior. Student academic conduct remains one part of it, but also thinking about publication ethics, research integrity, research ethics, as more and more students become involved in research earlier on in undergraduate research, PhD by publication, for example, students working in labs. And then there's been so many news stories about fraudulent and fabricated data coming from different labs, and that students may be caught in this, right? And it would be completely unfair for a student to be called up for misconduct, for data fabrication, manipulation, falsification, if the lab manager has been complicit in all of that. Yeah, thank you, Maha, for the comment of students being hyper aware, right, when faculty are modeling integrity. And it doesn't mean that we walk around and we're perfect human beings. We know that we're imperfect human beings, right? And I don't see academic integrity as an end point. It's not about like cheating or not cheating. It's part of a daily practice. One of the things I like to align it to is Margaret Wheatley's work on leadership. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with Margaret Wheatley's work, but she talks about leadership as a daily practice and getting up in the morning and doing what you can that day. And at the end of the day, forgiving yourself for what you haven't been able to do, or things that you did that you wish you had done differently. And then that day is closed and you get up the next day and you begin that daily practice. And her talk about leadership reminded me of yoga practice, and how academic integrity or ethical practice can be the same thing. We get up in the morning, we do things intentionally with the idea of being the best that we can in terms of ethics and integrity that day, and being human, knowing that we're going to do it imperfectly, and also extending that generosity and taking a charitable approach to our students as well. knowing that so much of what we call academic misconduct might also be phrased as poor academic practice. Colleagues in Ireland have used the phrase academic impoverishment for those students who just have not had the opportunity to learn certain skills that we expect them to have. So that this is part of what we do. Just looking at Yasser's comment here about environments often impose their value on the inhabitants. If the environment is great, the inhabitants will be great too, and so on. I love that comment. Thank you for sharing that. So this, I think this framework of comprehensive academic integrity will shake things up. Because there's still in some pockets this idea of students needing to be punished when they commit transgressions, right? And we want to be able to challenge that and look at basically justice through a different lens, a kinder lens. And also the new handbook has a section on equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility. It's edited by Dr. Cecilia Panther, and she's a Black woman scholar from the United States who did her PhD on the experiences of Black women in student conduct, working in student conduct in higher education in the United States. So she's just got a new job at Le Moyne College. She did a fantastic job finding authors to contribute. So some of them, I think you'll know some of them, Eliana El-Khoury, I think who presented in MyFest, and Gagne. And so there's some great chapters that for the first time are challenging these ideas around academic integrity that previously have gone unchallenged. The idea that academic integrity policies need to be uniform in order to be fair. That this law that we use, at least in North America and Western speaking countries, British colony countries, that we have policies, procedures that are built largely on British parliamentary procedures, British legislative traditions, that the idea that must be applied in equal ways, the law must be applied or the policy must be applied in equal ways, and that being fundamentally inequitable. So Maha, I'm going to put Cecilia's name in the chat here. Cecilia Panther. Often it will get auto-corrected to Panther, but it's a P-A-R-N-T-H-E-R, Cecilia Panther. And she's also done some really great work around surveillance and e-proctoring or online proctoring and the discrimination against persons of darker skin tones. So that's some interesting work that she's done that would be worth looking up as well. So I kind of wanted to just situate who I am and where I'm at with my understanding of academic integrity, that it's not about punishing students for cheating on exams. That student conduct remains an important piece of this, but it's certainly not all of it. And if we want to talk about academic integrity, we must also talk about integrity in other parts of the academy. And also looking in this, I mean, when Cecilia saw this framework, she challenged me, rightfully so, and said, where's equity and diversity and inclusion? And so we've been having some great conversations back and forth about this and how to integrated in intentional and meaningful ways. So this is this iteration for this handbook. Future iterations might look different, and I welcome your ideas about how this could be even better going forward. Okay, this is a list of the chapters that are going to be in the handbook, and the reason that I wanted to share it with you is the sections. Each section has, I think, between 12 or 6 and 12 chapters. It's section 7 that Cecilia's done on ethics, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and academic integrity. And I think we also added accessibility in there as well. It went through a few different iterations during production, and I don't know in the end what will end up being in the handbook itself, but certainly accessibility is in there, as is decolonization. So this framing around these fundamental values for academic integrity, lots of folks in North America know about this, and it has been used internationally. It was originally designed by the Center for International Integrity. It's now the International Center for Academic Integrity. Was originally constructed by a fellow named his name's McCabe, Don McCabe, and his colleagues who set up this center. And McCabe did lots of research around academic integrity in the 90s and the 2000s. And he passed away in 2016. The International Center for Academic Integrity continues to exist. And they talk about these 6 fundamental values for academic integrity: courage, fairness, honesty, respect, responsibility, and trust. And these are often presented as a universal values framework, which I actually find kind of problematic. So, for example, being in Canada, I don't have lived experience of things like an honor code school or a traditional honor code school or a modified honor code school. If there's someone here who has that lived experience, I'd love to hear your ideas about honor code schools in the chat. As I understand it, in a traditional honor code school, that if students see other students engaging in misconduct, that they're expected to report them. And if they don't report them, they too can be held responsible for misconduct. In other words, I mean, here in Canada, we would say like kids ratting out each other. That doesn't happen. It wouldn't happen. We would never expect children or people in university to report on their peers' behaviors. Yeah, thanks, Maha, for saying that your students resisted strongly. We don't have it in Canada. Certainly during the pandemic, there were some schools here that wanted honor codes as a way to fix academic misconduct, and also resisted and saying there's lots of research to show that students will not report, nor should they be expected to, that that's not the job of a student, that the student's main responsibility is to learn for themselves, not to police their peers. And that was considered a traditional honor code school, and students will take pledges around academic integrity, and there's some pomp and circumstance around it. And I understand in a modified honor code school, students are still expected to report, but they won't be held responsible if they don't. But this is framed under the value of courage, that students need to have the courage to tell if their peers are cheating, and I find that problematic, right? So these can be understood in lots of different ways. And another one that I kind of like to highlight is this idea of responsibility. And this is often framed as students having or needing the responsibility to know the policies, to act according to the rules, and so forth. But there's lots of evidence to show that students have responsibilities to social and peer groups as well. And one of those is to share and help each other. And sometimes when I talk with North American audiences, this can become very prickly and say, well, we don't want students sharing or helping, that they need to do their own work. And yet I've been able to trace back news items, and I wrote about this in Plagiarism in Higher Education, news items of a practice called Frat Files, F-R-A-T, Frat Files. It's a pejorative term. I'll unpack it for you if you're unfamiliar with it. Frat files, it's short for fraternity files, also used in sororities in the United States. We have Greek societies, fraternity sororities in Canada, but not to the extent that they do in the United States. But there was an expectation that students, members of the fraternities and sororities, would contribute to files, like by adding their own exams, their old assignments, their old essays to physical file folders that were stored in the houses owned by the Greek societies to help other students who were members of the society. And if students didn't, then they were considered basically bad citizens of the society. There was an expectation to help their student peers. So just like Hero and Chegg, but these were analog versions. There's evidence of this practice dating back to the 1940s. So almost 100 years of this that's been documented. And so much of this, when I talk with people, they say, oh, and they'll often say, oh, international students sharing their work. I'm like, no. The frat files go back to, they were also called test files or exam files, go back almost 100 years. And the practice has been alive and well in North American white middle class communities. And so lots of people aren't aware of that. I'm like, no, there's issues here around discrimination and racism when we talk about international students helping each other and sharing in this way. I'm like, no, students have shared for a long time. And so one of the things I've advocated for in my university is the idea of what we would call a safe sharing space. We used to have this to some extent where students could go to a department and ask for old copies of a test or an exam. That I think that stopped during COVID for sure. But I'm like, no, we need these digital spaces now, whether it's Google Docs or somewhere on a learning management system or somewhere that students can go and that's okay for them, because companies like Chegg and Course Hero are not sanctioned by universities, as far as I know. That might be a business endeavor that they've tried to get and have been largely unsuccessful with, but it's largely unregulated. And also with services like that, so I'll often use the term commercial file sharing service instead of naming particular companies, but you know what I mean when I'm talking about them. Students don't know that the ways in which their information is being harvested by those companies when they give up their email address, their credit card information, that these companies are maybe contacting them to ask them to upload more things, that they may be reaching out to them in a variety of ways. And I also heard during COVID, when there was extreme financial distress for some of our students, that in some of the services would pay students a nominal amount to upload materials, right? Maybe they would get, I don't know, $5 if they uploaded 50 documents. And for some students, that $5 became the money they used to eat. So I don't think that necessarily students uploading to these services can be a bad thing. It might be, but there's a lot to unpack there. But the corporatization and commercialization of student learning can be problematic when we don't know the ways in which the companies might be using student data. So there's some things to unpack there. I'll get to the artificial intelligence stuff soon, I promise. But I wanted to share this idea about this tension. Yeah, thanks, Danielle. I'd never thought about that. Universal basic income being a solution to academic integrity. It might be. I never thought about it, but yes. I also have heard lots of anecdotes about students engaging in contract cheating or being the suppliers or providers of contract cheating services because they need the money, they need to eat, or they need to pay their rent. So they write essays for other people. And this is how they earn some income. So that's a whole other piece to the commodified part of academic misconduct. Teddy Fishman is an author from the US, and she used to be involved with the International Center for Academic Integrity, but she and I wanted to do a comparison of academic integrity in Canada and the United States, because so often our two countries are considered in the same way, but we don't have things like honor codes in Canada, as far as I know. And so we started sort of teasing things apart. When we got into this, we found sort of two different schools of thought in the US that I thought was really interesting, that I hadn't seen disentangled in this way before, about one school of thought around academic integrity being around values and morality. That values framework I presented, for example, coming out of the International Center for Academic Integrity. And the idea that if students can uphold certain values, then they will act with integrity. Then there's a whole different group of people, led largely by folks like Becky Moore-Howard, who's retired now, Sandra Jameson, Lisa Panning-Davies, Amy Robillard, who say, no, take morality out of this. This has nothing to do with being a good human or bad human. This is a skill development issue. And our students need us to teach them skills like citing, referencing, paraphrasing, and all of the other skills. Morality has no place in this conversation. Take it out. And they're really adamant about that. So, and we started to say, okay, have there ever been any evidence that folks from these two different camps have written together, presented together? We couldn't find any evidence. So what we found is sort of a polarization. And in talking with folks, say, okay, well, which camp do you fit in? And when we ask people about that, they're like, I'm not sure, maybe both. I don't know. Sometimes one. It is kind of a strange polarization, right? And that led me to think, where do we sit in Canada? I think we're kind of both, but I think we're also having a lot more conversations here about decolonizing and indigenizing academic integrity, led largely by folks like Kita Gladue. So I'll get to the artificial intelligence piece of it now. Yeah, the values are learned. Thanks, Newman, for sharing that. We have a project going at the University of Calgary around artificial intelligence and academic integrity that we got a teaching and learning grant for in 2022. That I'll share the timeline with you because I think it's probably relevant. When I was working on plagiarism in higher education, so it starts with history of plagiarism. If you're not a plagiarism scholar, it's pretty boring. Where are we at today? But this final chapter, what's the future of plagiarism look like? Starting to think about the impact of academic integrity, in artificial intelligence rather. And what does this mean? So writing this book in 2020 during the pandemic, there's all of these other things going on during the pandemic around e-proctoring and surveillance. At that point, GPT-2 is out. I have colleagues at Brock University in Canada. I know that they're working on this. And so we thought, okay, well, we need to start working on this. So book went into the publisher in May of 21. And then I started to put together a team because I want to study this. I want to know what this is going to mean for teaching and learning. And we were allowed to submit a draft of our grant application for feedback to our teaching and learning committee. And we got feedback. And the feedback that we got was, isn't this a little bit Star Trek? Like, do you really think artificial intelligence is going to have any place in our classrooms in our lifetime? And we're like, yeah, we do. We really do. So we beefed up our literature review and we got the grant in January of 22. So before ChatGPT came out, right? And so money came into our accounts like April of 22. We started our project, and then ChatGPT came out after that. So I wanted to share something with you about our team. I wanted this to be a transdisciplinary research team. So I'm in the School of Education. I reached out to my colleague in the School of Engineering. He'd done things like around agent-based modeling and machine learning, and then wanted to connect with folks who were into the humanities. So someone from the Faculty of Arts, Department of English, Creative Writing, and wanted to get his take on it. And then I wanted to do something that was a little bit unconventional. And so I invited my colleague from Student Accessibility Services onto the project. And this was very unconventional for a couple of reasons, because typically at our university, people who do research and are involved in research projects are academics. The others on the project were either research assistants or people who held an academic role. But I wanted to include someone who worked in student-facing work. And so our colleague Brenda McDermott joined us. Brenda is a member of our professional staff. So she's not a professor, but she is a manager at Student Accessibility Services and works directly with students who need academic accommodations and specifically for exams. But we wanted to bring her in for her understanding of this. And this had not really been done too often before, at least in our university, that we had a member of professional staff and we had someone on the project whose entire area of expertise around accessibility was meant to be a fully integrated part of what we were doing for our project. So she had to get special permission from her boss to join our project because she doesn't have a research role. We advocated for her. We're like, we really want her on our project because we knew that if we wanted to study artificial intelligence and academic integrity, we wanted to do it through this equity lens, inclusion lens, and accessibility lens. So I need to give a shout out to Brenda because much of what I've learned has come from her. And what we wanted to do was, we talked about algorithmic writing technologies. That's the language we had at the time. Now, of course, we'd say ChatGPT or large language models. We wanted an evidence base to make some recommendations. And we also wanted to focus on academic integrity as a teaching and learning imperative, not as a way to talk about how to punish students. So that was our entire focus around this. And we started with, okay, how are we defining these kind of key terms? So at the time when we started our project, we relied on our engineering colleague to help us with these definitions. So he drew our attention to this definition for AI around computing systems that are able to engage in human-like processes, such as learning, adapting, synthesizing, self-correction, use of data for complex processing tasks. This was important for our team at the time, because you may recall that there was a former employee, I think it was of Google, who was saying that AI is sentient, and we need to be really afraid. And we were like, no, we weren't convinced that AI was sentient, at least not at the time we started our project. I think we're still not convinced of that, but it was the idea of human-like processes, not human, not sentient. And algorithmic text generating software, well, lots of folks know this as LLM now, writing tech capable of creating original text either from scratch or with user input. This definition was important to us for academic integrity and plagiarism because of this idea of original text. So plagiarism is often designed as or defined as copying someone else's text without citation, attribution, that kind of thing. And we often tell students that if their work is not original, then they can be called up for misconduct. So we wanted to contemplate this idea of originality here. We don't have all the answers. And just also acknowledging like this term ChatGPT, we're all using it similar to the way we use the term Kleenex, right? I mean, we could be talking about a facial tissue that's a brand from any number of different producers, but we say Kleenex and we all know that we mean a facial tissue. When we say ChatGPT, we're talking about a name that's become synonymous with artificial intelligence tools and specifically large language models. But as far as I can tell, ChatGPT is on the way out with lots of other things taking its place. And if you're not familiar with this directory, it's worth looking at, the Futurepedia, futurepedia.io. So I can put this in here. Yeah, thank you. Maha saying the large language models are often synthesizing and reproducing the ideas of people without referencing and citing the sources. It's true. And if you're watching the news, then you will no doubt have seen there are some very prominent authors, including some Canadian authors, with Margaret Atwood, I think, leading the charge, railing against OpenAI and other companies for taking and appropriating their work and using it as part of their corpus without giving them any attribution. And I think that in Hollywood, there's writers, I don't know if it's a strike that's going on or some labor action where there may be some outsourcing of some of the writing to AI. This directory is updated on a daily basis. And last I checked, I think it had about 4,500 apps in it. So as of July, there was 4,300. So there's many more now. Thank you, Aaliyah, for adding that. This contains not only large language models, but also AI apps for video editing, images, and so on, all kinds of different apps, mathematics, text-based, non-text-based disciplines. So when my colleagues talk about ChatGPT, I'm like, there's thousands of apps out there that our students have access to. And one of the positions we've taken is that it's not really helpful to try and ban these technologies. We wanted to know what are the ethical implications of AI tech for teaching, learning, and assessment. We're really interested in the ethics of this. Yeah, and thanks, Mark, for pointing out that there's every indication that AI capabilities will be fully integrated into everyday Office products like Microsoft Office and Google Docs and others very soon. And it's coming. It's already coming. And I've been noticing shifts. Someone told me that they went to post something on LinkedIn and there was a bot to help them, an AI assistant. I haven't seen that yet, so I don't know if it's just being rolled out in the United States first, but it's coming in other forms of like social media and things we use, Web of Science, other databases. So the tech will be integrated. If you're interested, you can take our survey. We based our survey on one at Brock University in Canada. I mentioned them earlier. Our colleagues at Brock University designed a survey that they administered only in their faculty of education because they wanted to know, can university professors in education tell the difference between text generated by AI and text generated by humans? And they focus on education because that's where they are, but also because education profs are teaching teacher trainees. So they wanted to be future oriented and think about this. With their permission and collaboration, we've updated the survey so that it can be used across all faculties. I can tell you that our folks at Brock ran their survey as a pilot survey. They got about a couple hundred responses, 200 and some responses, 2/3 failure rate. About 62% of their respondents could not correctly identify when text was written by an AI versus a human, meaning that sometimes people flagged text written by a human as having been written by an AI, or text written by an AI as having been written by a human. So we wanted to see what's happening across our campus. So we're currently running our survey now. We're collecting data. We want to be able to collect it by the end of the year. Yeah, real or fake tests. We called it a modified Turing test. And I want to give a shout out here to Brenda McDermott because she's contributed a lot to these next couple of slides. Brenda let our team know that this precursor to generative pre-trained transformer text was predictive text, and that the predictive text that we use on our cell phones that will help us finish our sentences on text and so forth started in the 1980s. And she took me back to an original source because she knows I love that kind of thing, to an article from 1987. There was another one from 86 that I read that talked about word processing programs with predictive text were originally designed for persons with disabilities. And thank you, Mark, for sharing your exercise that you do with your students. So this was something our team didn't know about. Perhaps folks in this community know about it a lot more, that the origins of predictive text and the real origins of ChatGPT going back about 40 years. And the origins of some of this were designed to help as an assistive or an adaptive technology. And we thought, okay, this is really interesting for us because this actually gives us a historical and scientific starting point to think about artificial intelligence apps being used in assistive and adaptive ways. And one of the questions that Brenda brought to our team was, if AI apps are an assistive or an adaptive technology, would we be denying students human rights or violating students' human rights if we tried to deny them access? That was a question that we hadn't considered, and it's become very central to our entire research project. And so I think it's one of the reasons now when schools have been banning ChatGPT and other AI apps, I've been pretty vocal in my own country about railing against it, with specifically for this reason, and looking at it from a human rights perspective. And we don't know yet how the technologies can be used or integrated in ethical ways. Yeah, it was a big question from Brenda. Like, if we ban the apps, are we denying students human rights? I was like, it's amazing. She's an amazing thinker. And if you need a speaker for next year, I would recommend her, because every time I talk to her, she blows my mind in really great ways. So that question helped us drive conversations on our campus, because we also had conversations on our campus around, like, should we ban this technology? Like, we were like, how do you ban it? And then after how do you ban it came the question of, well, why? Why would you ban it? Especially if it can be helpful. Can it level the playing field? If it's an assistive or an adaptive technology. We know that lots of students come to our campuses with diagnosed learning disabilities. We also know that there's a lot of students with undiagnosed or undocumented disabilities because they don't want to disclose. And there is an expectation of disclosure of a disability in order to get accommodation. So ultimately, we'd also like to challenge that idea. But maybe I'll just stop sharing this slide for a second, and just maybe so we can have some conversation here about, like, what are your thoughts on this idea of the use of AI as an assistive or an adaptive technology, and the idea of a question around banning it somehow being connected to violating human rights. I'd welcome your input on that. Feel free to take the mics if you want to chime in. Thank you, Aaliyah, for posting the link here to some takeaways from the session. I really, really appreciate that. Yeah, I see, Mark, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Well, thanks for this wonderful presentation. I'm just loving everything that you're saying. And the point you're making was brought to my attention from my colleague at UC Santa Barbara, who some of these folks know, Jeremy Douglas. Someone was asking him about the use of ChatGPT on college applications, the personal essay. And he just, easily pointed out the number of privileged students who have access to consulting services, in-school counselors who and other actors who are perfectly available to help them craft their essay by hand into whatever is going to help them get into the school. And then I started thinking about really my own help that I give to my own children as a professional writing instructor, right? And of course, all of the lessons on English I've been giving them all this time. And I find this your whole intervention here to be again kind of breathtaking, especially when I think about the number of students who rely on these tools in my writing classes who are not native English speakers, who are already using translation software as a starting point, and then might be able to integrate or more easily access other aspects of the class if they had automated translation tools even more readily at their available for things like forum posts and all those things that we assume are equitable, right? We're going to have an in-class discussion. People post your comments in the Zoom chat, right? I don't know. I find this whole line of inquiry to be fascinating. And one more thing I'll throw out there, which I think you're well aware of, was it Emily Bender's team who also discovered all the false positives with the second language writers in ChatGPT on ChatGPT. Is it GPT-0? And it was disproportionately there. Anyway, your talk today is opening my eyes, and I'm really grateful for it.
And thanks so much for these comments, right? You've brought a couple of things to mind for me, one of which was an article by Emma Whitford from Forbes magazine in the United States last December of 22. And she talked about how the title was "A College Can Write Your College Essay, Maybe Better Than You Can." But I think they edited the title because the whole article is about college admissions essays and how she went through and she did the article, and then she did sort of an appendix showing how she did this, but she used ChatGPT to write college admissions essays and included things like personal details from students. She's like, okay, I'm a student from India. I live in this village. I have two parents, and then ChatGPT wrote these admissions essays around this. And in some cases, she then sent these essays out to people and said, would this student get admission to your college? And some people wrote back and said, yeah, the student would get admission based on this college admissions essay that didn't exist because it was all written by ChatGPT. But you're right. And there's been some really interesting work done around admissions fraud and students from privileged backgrounds having access to tutors. And sometimes those tutors will write their college admissions essays for them. And so the good college admission essay, as being an indicator of academic or intellectual capability, has been a false benchmark for a long time, because wealthy students can have others write their essays for them. But now the playing field is leveled again because ChatGPT can help those students, right? So when colleagues come to me, I did a session for a nonprofit organization here locally, and they give out student scholarships based on an essay. They're like, well, we're worried about students cheating with ChatGPT. And I said, don't be. I said, because some of your students have already been cheating by outsourcing those essays for a long time. And they were like, what? They didn't know about contract cheating. So raising awareness about contract cheating, I think, is an important piece of the conversation. Yasser and then Jenny. Yasser, go ahead.
So I'll just come back to what you just have been mentioning about the idea of using AI as an adaptive technology or assistive technology. So I'm an accessibility tester. Sometimes I do test materials and I do test apps as well. And yesterday I got one of the invitations to test a new technology called Be My AI. And in this technology, they tend to use the AI as a kind of, you just take a picture and will just generate the alternative text. But I was struck by their policy because they just wrote, don't use this for cheating, don't use this for copying exam questions, don't do this, don't do that. So it was really on the fence, they sat on the fence. They had a kind of an equitable policy. While we're providing this early access technology to you, we are not asking you to use it unwisely, and we're not asking you to we're not asking you to manipulate it to your own to something that is not really you know, good. Just use it to generate photos for your own, like use it to just, for example, read prescriptions or whatever. So it was really wonderful to read such a policy while the technology is provided, and these people are not educators, but I really appreciated how they brought that up into the discussion, and how they tried to cultivate the compassionate value into the AI use while providing some technology at the same time.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And it does bring to light the ways in which the technology can be used for different purposes, and the potential futility of trying to police the ways in which the tech is used. So one of the things I think I contend with is when people came to me early on and said, well, you know, ChatGPT is just a new way to plagiarize, right? And it wasn't helped for people like me who studied plagiarism when really well-known scholars like Noam Chomsky came forward and said, you know, ChatGPT is nothing more than high-tech plagiarism. When you get a prominent global scholar like Noam Chomsky weighing in and equating ChatGPT automatically to plagiarism, people, I think, will go to that and will hang a lot on the opinion of someone like that without thinking through some of the complexities and nuances and other ways that the tech can be used. And I mean, I'm who am I to challenge someone like Noam Chomsky? I mean, he's been at this for an awfully long time, but at the same time, I think that comments like that can shut down other kinds of challenges or discourse. So yeah, Jenny, go ahead.
I think we are in a similar position, not with Noam Chomsky weighing in, thank goodness, but we were trying to negotiate from quite early on, sort of December, January time, how to tease out with our students the difference between using it to think, you know, to sort of support exploration and things like that, then using it in such a way you need to acknowledge the use. So not referencing outputs from it because you didn't actually use an output, but acknowledging, there's a tiny person behind me, but acknowledging the use of it. Okay, Kira, in your work. And then finally, how to reference outputs in it to acknowledge that where it came from and the kind of implications it might be to have that writing and whatever it is that you're doing. And it's very tricky. We were lucky at our university that there was an academic already working to co-create a code of conduct with her students on the use of AI tools, and that they were very, very thoughtful, as students usually are. And so we were able to integrate some of her work. But I work at a very, very large institution where academic integrity is a real hot topic. And a lot of assumptions are made over who and how people approach their assessments. And I think this is one where it's exposed a little bit of perhaps not laziness, but sort of complacency with some of our assessment models, where we've conflated the method of assessment, so the essay, with the actual goal, which is understanding the student knowledge of content. And so it's also kind of overturned a number of boats that we thought were quite safely moored. And I think that was one of the things that makes it so difficult, is it's sort of coming at higher education, especially and schools, from so many different directions. So it seems like not enough, does it, to look at it just as use of a tool.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Newman, for sharing the code of conduct that you've been working on. If you have, Jenny, if you have links that you're able to share, I'd welcome seeing them. And I think you're right that this has really disrupted a lot of what we do in higher education. And as a scholar of plagiarism, you know, I have 2 degrees in literature, right? So I love literature. I love writing. And I come from a text-based discipline. But I'm at the point now where I'm telling folks, I think the 5-paragraph essay is palliative, and it's time to let it rest in peace with its dignity, because ChatGPT has changed everything, right? And if you've tried ChatGPT, you'll know that it can generate, you know, perfectly grammatically correct 5-paragraph essay in seconds. And I've had colleagues come back and say, well, you know, writing is a way of showing that you can think. And it's interesting for me, I turn in part to Phil Dawson's work. He talks a little bit about cognitive offloading, and I'll share some of his work here. And it's not, he didn't come up with the idea of cognitive offloading. He drew on other people's work, but he has some great work on cognitive offloading here. And so I think he's got a chapter in a book called Reimagining University Assessments in a Digital World, and might be open access, I can't remember. And he's got another one, another bit in his book on defending assessment security. But he talks about, goes right back to Socrates. And there's a piece, and like if you read the Socrates, I went back and read it myself, conversation with Phaedrus, allegedly, where Socrates says that writing is lazy. And we should be suspicious of writing, because good scholars, people who really know what they're talking about, will keep knowledge inside them, in their head and in their heart, and they will share it orally. And that if someone had to write it down, it was a way of maybe remembering it for the future, but that we should be cautious about writing things down because it could make us lazy. And I was like, what? Like, this kind of disrupted everything for me. And it was this idea of oral traditions as being somehow better than writing. And I thought, okay, so we've gone from Socrates saying this way back when to the development of the printing press that came with it, along the concurrent increase in literacy and people being able to read and write, and the democratization of knowledge, largely after the printing press, right around like 1450s. And then with that increase in literacy and people being able to do that over the next couple of 100 years, then we get the beginnings of colonization to the New World. And by the time universities are as fully established, I'm not talking about like, you know, the ones that go back to like 1200 AD, but the ones, you know, like we've got universities becoming commercialized, commodified, amplified by about the 1800s. Then by around the Industrial Revolution, literacy is becoming seen as a way to escape from poverty, that you need to know how to read and write in order to get a job, to get a better job, to feed your family. That literacy somehow became synonymous with economic survival. And the idea that in order to know how to communicate, you had to be able to write. But I'm thinking that ChatGPT is taking us back to other conversations. I'm not suggesting that we only go back to oral assessment. I'm suggesting that our preoccupation with writing has become almost pathological, and we need to be able to disrupt things. Maha, go ahead.
Yeah, as you were saying this, I was remembering something that I tell people a lot, that unless what you're teaching is writing, students are actually learning something and writing about it. Where's the thing that they're learning? If they were learning something that they learn to do in the world, they're learning to do engineering, or they're learning to do marketing, they're learning to do something. That thing, ChatGPT is not going to be able to do that thing. It can help them write about the thing. But you know what we're actually teaching, unless we're writing teachers or language teachers, is not writing. So where's that other thing? And why do we feel like representing it in writing is like the only way? And is what we're teaching so generic that the tool can write about it even if we haven't done the work? Like, it shouldn't be like that. And all I'm sort of thinking about next semester is how many non-writing related experiences can I have my students end up writing about, so that they do the work and they get engaged and interested in work that they want to write about. And then if ChatGPT helps them write about it, I don't mind, as long as they've actually learned the thing that they're there to learn, you know. I'm going to shift to a different topic. And my concern is, you know, having students be sort of transparent about how they've used AI in their writing or whatever is what I've been trying to do. What I'm concerned about is, unlike something like Wikipedia, which has the references for where everything's coming from, ChatGPT won't tell you where it got anything from. And then that means that the students don't actually know the depth of something they're working on. So if it's something that's been written about a million times, it's probably less important who first wrote about it, but sometimes it's just like one or two particular people who've ever written about this thing. And what I'm doing right now is like, okay, who's the person who writes about this thing? It won't tell you its sources, but you can ask it, who is someone who writes about this thing? And it tends to get real sources for that, versus when it hallucinates about references. But you can ask it the question in different ways. And it's just sort of about, how do we help students become AI literate so that they know how to use it in ways without losing the important things related to sort of the trail of knowledge, credibility, and I have no idea what fake news is going to look like. I mean, I knew that there were deep fakes many years ago, and fake faces. I like with those fake voices. I just talked about like 5 things.
Yeah, and I've seen some of the recommendations from organizations like APA to how to cite ChatGPT. That makes me laugh, I got to be honest, because when I think about citation and referencing and attribution as a plagiarism scholar, and I talked about the provenance of my own work, that I talk about provenance, like I want to know where does the work come from. And when I teach, doctoral students, how to read articles, right? They've been taught their whole life to like summarize an academic article and what are the key ideas, what's the main argument, what's the purpose statement, and I kind of start from a different place with them. I say, okay, who wrote the article? And they're like, what? I mean, so often students will not be aware of who wrote an article. That's something that you learn as a scholar, early career and then beyond. You're like, okay, I want them to learn who's writing about what, where were they trained, who did they learn from, where are they working, what is their context, and how does that impact the work that they're doing. And so starting from that perspective of who is writing and what are they sharing, and going from there with something new for those students, but teaching reading in a different way, because summarizing now can be done by an app. I'm like, I don't want you to summarize the article. I want to be able to talk to you about the article, and what did you learn from it, and how has it impacted you, and who's impacting you, whose thinking is influencing you. But in this, I think that there are connections for me to neoliberalism, the commodification of education, the way that assessment has been scaled up, right? We've got the 5-paragraph essay, we've got these writing, criteria or assessments so that all markers can be standardized. People are grading, in ways that are uniform. I'm like, but should they be? Like, why shouldn't students be able to write in their preference way? So if somebody wants to write in Pidgin English, well, why shouldn't we let them? Because that's who they are. Like, we've imposed this academic English as being somehow superior to other forms of English. And I think now is a great time to be able to challenge that. Newman, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm loving this session so much. I just wanted to add that, just piling on to agree that some of what I've heard from some colleagues that are really fetishizing writing in terms of it's how they think best, or assuming that that's how all people think best. And I think this is a great opportunity just to pile on to what you're saying, that like, isn't education about learning how each individual thinks and works best, and not about how the professor or whoever the person is does that? And I feel like we can, if somebody learns that they think best through writing, then they should prioritize writing themselves in order to do that. If somebody thinks best through I don't know, dancing, then they should do that. And I feel like as educators, we have a responsibility to like think with students about exploring that, rather than just like, and through all of time I feel like we've been evolving how we think best based on the tools that are available to us. And I think this is just totally agreeing with you. The same, the point that's like a frustration is just where individuals think that because it works for them, it must work for others, and they need to transmit that knowledge. I think it's coming from a space of like actually trying to be generous. Like, I finally figured out when I was blah, blah, blah age, like how I could focus the best, or I could think the best, or how I did my best work. And then they're like, let me transmit that to everyone else. And it's like, wait a second, that might not be what serves everybody else. So anyway, just wanted to share that. And thanks so much for this and for all your work.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks for that. I think you've made a really, really important point there. And there's been some assumptions in higher education that somehow uniformity equates to quality. right? We see this in things like the way courses are designed, right? If you're teaching a large lecture, like an intro English course, right? That you say there's 1,000 students and they're broken up into, you know, lectures or tutorials, and everybody needs to mark the same, grade the papers the same way. And this has been considered fair for students, right? That somehow and this has been equated to quality assurance, because academic integrity and quality assurance, right, go hand in hand. And then we talked about earlier about the uniform application of academic misconduct policies and procedures somehow being seen as more fair and more just. And like challenging that has been really difficult in my spaces. I'm like, well, what if it's not? What if the you know, uniform application of policies and procedure is actually inequitable? And how do we make it more equitable for different students? And people don't know what to do. Like they're like, oh, we're compromising integrity, compromising quality. We have to have one way of doing things. I'm like, no, we don't. We don't have to have one way of addressing what we call misconduct, or one way of defining misconduct, and that there needs to be some latitude there. So yeah, plus what you've just said, 100% for sure. And when I come into policy discussions and say to people, I'm like, well, you know, there's other ways of doing this. There's other ways of addressing alleged misconduct. First of all, is it misconduct? Is it not? Is it plagiarism? Is it not? Is another question. But things like restorative practices, restorative resolutions, alternative resolutions to traditional ways of imposing sort of a justice that we see in higher education, where there's been an alleged transgression and there needs to be a commensurate punishment, right? That punishment is a reduction in the grade of the assignment, failure of the course, exclusion from the course, exclusion from the university. Like, but what if there was a different way, and a radically different way that focused on students as human beings and compassion and dignity? And you know, I presented that framework of those like 6 fundamental values of academic integrity. I struggle with that a lot, because there's things missing from there, with one of the most important ones for me, and I've written about this pretty openly, is being dignity. In so many of the academic misconduct policies and procedures and practices that we have, students are stripped of their dignity, which is a fundamental human right under the United Nations. And so many of our universities fail to consider the importance of allowing students to maintain their dignity if there's been an alleged transgression. So if we're going to talk about values, then things like dignity, I think, need to be really brought to the forefront as being fundamental to how we act ethically and with integrity in our higher education spaces. Because if we're stripping students of their dignity in the name of academic integrity, yet we're not acting in ethical ways. I don't think, well, we're not. So that's a little bit of me on a soapbox there. Supporting students in navigating the biases in AI tools. How do we decolonize our use of these tools, given the difficulty in decolonizing the tools themselves? This is an amazing question, Shane. Thank you so much. I don't have a clear answer for you, but I think that the questions that we're talking about here around decolonization, equity, need to be really brought to the forefront. And like mentioning things like, okay, APA coming in and saying, okay, here's how you cite ChatGPT, and then any student who doesn't cite ChatGPT is somehow, you know, again, committing misconduct. I'm like, well, I can't go back and trace the breadcrumbs of a citation to ChatGPT and get back to an original source. That for me is why I do citing and referencing, so I can go back and find an original source, or at least find out who said the original source, right? Because some of the companies that produce these style guides, it's important to remember that APA, MLA, and other ones, they're creating these style guides as a way to generate revenue for their organizations. And that's why we get new style guides, like what, every 10 years or something, we get these updates. These are massive revenue generators for these organizations that produce them, and then somehow do this in the name of standards and quality. And when I look at APA, there's like a real failure, I think, and same with MLA, to, for example, cite Indigenous knowledge. So I put this work here by Laura Nikoja from that's one of them. Sorry, that's not the person I'm thinking of. Thinking of somebody else. She talks about the role of libraries in promoting academic integrity. Her work is also wonderful. And there's another one I'm thinking of, and she's from the James Smith Cree Nation. And she has an Indigenous citation guide for how to cite Indigenous knowledge. I'll see if I can find it and share it because it's open access. And it's wonderful. Another Larissa McLeod. I got her name wrong. Okay. So she talks about Indigenous knowledge as more than personal communication. And she gives templates for citing Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers, completely free, completely open access. And she offers this in part because of the failure of APA and MLA and other organizations to offer real viable ways of citing Indigenous knowledge, that she's like, okay, APA would tell you it's personal communication. And she rallies against that and said, no, this deserves to be elevated in different ways, because personal communication is sort of seen as this parenthetical or way of attributing knowledge to others. And so she offers these templates, which are really, really great. But when I think about citing and plagiarism, this becomes a way of policing or gatekeeping student behavior, when I want to flip it around and think of it as attribution and honoring the people who came before me and learning the knowledge from them. And in plagiarism higher education, I write down a way of doing literature reviews that I was taught by my PhD supervisor that I haven't seen written down anywhere. Doesn't mean it hasn't been, but I hadn't seen it. My PhD supervisor was originally from the north of England, but spent a lot of time in Papua New Guinea, and that influenced his thinking a lot before he came to Canada and started teaching in universities here. But he taught this way of teaching literature reviews that I now work with my own students. Okay, imagine you're coming to a circle where there's been a conversation going on for a long time. There's no history or timeline in this circle. Scholars past and present are in this circle talking together. And when we come to a circle, our first job is to listen and find out who's saying what, who's learning from whom, who's disagreeing with whom, what are the debates going on in the field, and being able to pay attention to the agreements, disagreements, scaffolding, learning from with one another in this circle. And when we're ready, then we contribute to the circle. And this for me was like, I had never heard of anything like that before. I had been taught about literature reviews in technical terms of like, okay, you go through and you come up with these themes, and then you would write out like a narrative literature review or chronological literature review. But this idea of coming to a circle and being in community with each other and learning with and from each other, and that the dialogues and debates have been going on for centuries, and the responsibility as a scholar to understand who were the dominant voices, who are the marginalized voices, how do we elevate the marginalized voices, that was all new for me. And I think it's a really, really important way of understanding how we come to things like literature reviews for students. Because if you ask me, ChatGPT can't do that. ChatGPT isn't part of our community. It can be transactional and go back and forth, but this idea of being, like we talk about generative, but being in this idea of being part of our community, yeah, that's what it doesn't have. So that for me is like when I talk with my students about academic integrity, that's what I want them to think about is attribution, paying respect to those that we learn from, also challenging, right? That those whom we've learned from don't need to be on a pedestal, that they can also be challenged. And maybe the knowledge that they shared is contextual to their time and place. And there may be pieces of it to carry forward and pieces of it to say, okay, that was from a particular time and place and we've moved on. And that can also be done in a respectful way. Including Chomsky, potentially, yes. So maybe I know we've got about 9 minutes left here, but just open the floor to other ideas and musings before I've got a couple more slides I want to share with you, just as some provocations before we wrap up, but other things to think about. Okay, maybe I'll go back to a few more slides here just to kind of offer some provocations. I'll go back to some equity pieces around academic integrity, move away from artificial intelligence, but it's connected. One of the things I wanted to think about here was the idea of checking biases and way back when Betty Leask in 2006 was writing about this, international students and the high risk of negative bias and racism when we talk about international students and academic misconduct. So this has been documented in the literature, but in ways that have not been highlighted or brought forward. So one of the things I want to do in my work is bring forward these conversations about bias and discrimination and racism. And, when we've talked about this before, this idea of international student being synonymous with cheating students somehow, and that, as equity advocates, that we need to challenge this as well. I do this regularly in my own circles. And this quotation from Betty Leask, like 15 years ago, it's still resonating with me. And she talks about students from quote unquote other cultures. Wherever you are from, there's always a student from somewhere else as being highlighted as being perpetrators of the crime against the academic community of enlightened Western scholars. I read this and I was like, oh my Lord, this really resonated with me. The idea of a crime against the academic community of enlightened Western scholars. When I think about equity and assessment, I'm like, the ways in which we continue to perpetuate certain ways of knowing and doing and assessing as being somehow enlightened or better than other ways. We continue to do this. So these are important conversations to have. So if you want to talk about equity and academic integrity in your own institutions, you can point back to this work by Betty Leask from 2006. And I've written about this as well. So I just kind of wanted to do a bit of framing here about the reality versus myths about who cheats and how are they cheating. And so Tracy Brettag in 2019 and did some research in Australia, and she talked about the rating between international and domestic students. So in all of these studies, international students are not really defined. I mean, there's this assumption that it's students, foreign-born students, right? This kind of thing. So I'm using this in a very loose way. But she talked about the rates of students, of international and domestic students, being about the same. And that was like, okay, this is interesting, because there'd been, other conversations about how international students would cheat more. But she's like, no, she had empirical data that showed that international students cheated about the same rate. And yet around the same time, a few years earlier in the United States, Beasley had conducted a study and showed that international students in the United States, so presumably students who were, I don't know how to define them, but, presumably not white native speaking Americans, were reported 5 times more than domestic students for cheating. 5 times more. So this speaks to questions of surveillance. Who gets surveilled for cheating? Who gets forgiven without ever being reported? So if the rates of cheating between international and domestic students, however you define that, it's about the same, but certain groups are getting reported more often, we need to talk about overrepresentation in the reporting of academic misconduct. Who's getting surveilled? Who's getting reported? Who's getting forgiven without ever being reported? These are big questions, and there's not a lot of data about it. When we look at gender and academic misconduct, right? Early studies showed that more men than women were engaging in academic cheating. And there's a really good reason for that. And that's because women were excluded from universities. So women weren't enrolled in universities. So when you look at the proportions of cheating, more men were being reported as cheating. So once women started to enter university at about the same rate as men, then they said, oh, well, more women are cheating now. No, women are being reported for cheating because there's more women who actually are enrolled in universities. Not very many studies yet that look at anything beyond binary genders yet. However, Beasley and Fabello also found that men were more likely to be reported for misconduct than women. So these are important conversations, right? And just sharing that quotation again to emphasize that international students more likely to be surveilled and reported for misconduct. Again, Mary Davis out of the UK talking about students from Asia and Africa. Specifically, she talks about students from China, India, and Pakistan being highlighted in the misconduct reporting data, and then students from Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana. So in other words, students from particular countries being highlighted more often in misconduct reporting data. Gray's, this is a small study from one university, the Open University in the UK, and talked about Black students being 22 times more likely to be reported for fraud than other students. I wasn't exactly sure how Gray was defining fraud here, because fraud and misconduct can be related, but they're not always the same. But that statistic for me was kind of staggering. So I won't go back to the post-plagiarism bit now, because I know we're just about out of time. But one of the things I kind of wanted to leave you with was some questions around, like, what are your thoughts now as we're wrapping up around things we can do, concrete things we can do to promote equity in our institutions and with our students. As you're leaving today and thinking about things, what are some things you might want to take forward into your practice and recommend to others, or resources that you might have? So I'll open the floor before we wrap up. I don't mind saying that one of the things I'm doing at my conversation now is openly challenging assumptions that rates of misconduct reporting and rates of incidents are the same thing, that we can't equate rates of reporting with rates of incidents. So that, for example, students who are getting reported more often doesn't necessarily mean that those students are the ones committing all the misconduct. And informally, I've used a phrase that I call the angel effect, which would be students who look like and sound like me. So white students, women, native English speakers. There's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that people from that demographic might get forgiven more easily than other students. We might get off with a warning without ever being reported, whereas the same transgression committed by a male student of color, for whom English is an additional language, may get reported more often and sanctioned more harshly. So there's really big questions there that we need to challenge in our own institutions about who's getting reported. This can extend, I think, to the use of artificial intelligence when we look at those tools as leveling the playing field. And if we're going to accuse students who may not speak English as a first language as somehow committing misconduct or plagiarism for using ChatGPT, I think that's really problematic, because our institutions then may be in a position where they haven't provided sufficient training to those students to succeed in the first place. So I think I'm just about out of time. So I think we need to close things there, Maha, but if it looks like maybe Maha had to step away. Oh no, you're still here. You're still here. I'm happy to continue the conversations. I'm on Twitter, X, LinkedIn, Facebook. Feel free to reach out on all those platforms. Thank you for the invitation to join you today. It's been wonderful. And thank you for the conversations. I'm overjoyed to be part of this community and working with all of you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I did have to step away for a little bit, but I came back because I wanted to be here as you finished. Thank you so much for this. And we would love to have you some more and have more discussions around this. Some folks have been asking me if there's a Slack team for MyFest, and there is. It's not the most active Slack team, but it's there. If you register through Eventbrite, you should have gotten a link to join Slack from there. If you can't find it, just email me and I'll send it to you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.